Hello everyone and welcome to our Why Adolescence Missed the Point, Making Sense of the Manosphere and Incels webinar. The webinar will be presented by Andrew Wilson, and if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please drop them in the Q&A box and we'll run through them at the end. So let's get started. First, would you like to introduce yourself, Andrew?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, my name is Dr. Andrew Fergus Wilson, and I teach on criminology and on sociology, and I'm the program lead for BA Sociology and BA Criminology and Sociology. I came into academia through a kind of a slight hiatus between not doing what I wanted in A-levels and then realizing what really fascinated me about the world. So my mid-20s, I did BA, MA Cultural Studies, did a PhD in conspiracy theories, millennialism, which is effectively end of the world beliefs, and how they interact with collective identities, particularly national identities. Since then, I've been researching political violence, particularly extremist violence and extremist nationalism, which is why I'm here talking on this topic today. But also I'm interested in the environment and belief, landscape and belief, conspiracy theories, apocalypse and folklore. And I do other things. I have kids, I'm a parent, I like photography, stone circles, normal person stuff, well, as far as I'm concerned. I do have a bit of a research background in conspiracy theory, apocalypse, belief, extremism. I'm starting to change that to look at landscape, but today's topic, which is adolescence, incels, the manosphere, this overlaps really strongly with a lot of my interests around radicalization and extremism. So my overview of what I'm going to do today is concerned with exactly these kinds of questions. Firstly, what did adolescence do well? We're talking about it now, so this begins to flag up one of the things that it was successful with. But did it tell the whole story? And if it didn't, what was missing? Some of my intention today is to try to put the background stuff that adolescents didn't really touch on into some context. So talking about the manosphere, its prehistory, so-called pill culture, and asking, is it just boys and young men in their bedrooms? And this is one of the implications of the title of the program. This is adolescence. This is a young man's or older boy's issue. But are there other things going on in culture, society, even the economy more widely that have impacts here? I'm also going to touch on the overlap with other forms of extremism. I mean, given my track record in research, it's no surprise that this is going to be around far-right extremism. And then beginning to ask the question, where do we go from here? Is it just a case of the family going for a trip to the cinema together and rebuilding those connections? Or are there other things that we might be doing more widely as a way of responding to these issues? I'm not going to go into it in any depth today. This one really is something that perhaps you may be curious enough to talk about during a degree program, which touches on this, but we really need to talk about AI. I don't often use the auto-generated images in Microsoft PowerPoint. I highlighted my session overview, enter the text, and this image is what was suggested. I don't think it's a healthy image for our context. I don't think it's a healthy image in terms of people who are coded female. I don't think it's necessarily a healthy image in the context of the program Adolescence. And yet this is what AI generated. So technology, and particularly artificial intelligence, what gets called artificial intelligence, is also part of the conversation, albeit not one that I touch on today. However, this image just gave me the opportunity to flag up its relevance. So what did Adolescence do well? It was fantastic television. I think for those of us who've seen it, we know how moving it was, how powerful it was at an individual level, superb performances from fantastic actors, It was well-paced drama. It did a lot of televisual things. You can tell I'm not a theorist of media production, but it did televisual stuff incredibly well. That single shot that lasted for so long, it was innovative, interesting, engaging, emotionally resonant television. And it has been lauded as such. It won Emmys, it won Golden Globes. And I think in terms of the context that I'm talking about, what it also did was it started a conversation nationally and also internationally about young men, boys, and some of the struggles that they face when they become isolated and online becomes part of their response to a world that they find challenging. What didn't it do? Perhaps predictably, as a sociologist, I will say wider causes are not addressed. Those structural issues that I'm going to return to toward the end of this seminar. Generational misogyny is hinted at, but not really fully explored. So when I say generational misogyny, attitudes towards women and girls that are passed on from parents and other role models. It frames the issue of incel, male on female violence, as being about gender alone. Gender is clearly a key central part to it, but it's not the only factor which is driving young men into areas of online activity that are prone to radicalization. And I think the issue that I had almost immediately upon watching it was that the whole idea of online as a black box isn't really explored. So the main character goes off to his bedroom, gets radicalized, reappears. We don't know, we're not really exposed to what that kind of radicalizing narrative is. The complicating factor is there's no real single magic bullet process of radicalization. It changes from individual to individual. People get drawn in because of different factors in their lives, different individual subjective propensities to radicalization, but also the scripts that they engage with. Those vary. And so different things will appeal to different individuals. And more particularly, what we're dealing with isn't straightforwardly a process of going through various gatekeepers until one becomes radicalized. There's an entire subculture. There is a living, breathing, self-sustaining network of people who engage and are engaged through their interactions, through their shared outlooks, through their reinforcement of each other's beliefs. And this is where the manosphere developed, and this is how the manosphere developed. Now, manosphere is one of the terms that I'm going to begin to unpack. It's an umbrella term that refers to a range of different ways of men, young men and older men, thinking about and reflecting on their masculinity, individually and socially. Often in ways that are not helpful to a wider, more harmonious society, often quite fraught ways of thinking about the identity that puts them in competition with each other, but also especially with women. Manosphere is something that grows out of the men's rights movement and is also frequently equated with incels. So what are these terms? The men's rights movement emerged really in the 1990s and is associated with John Bly's book, Iron John, a book about men. Now, the reason Bly wrote this was a response to, but it wasn't opposed to feminism. What he was seeking to do was to find what is it that he felt was missing in males' relationships with each other. He saw men as being pitted against each other rather than being able to find a kind of a solidarity, a brotherhood, if you like. And a lot of his responses came out of what was called the mythopoetic men's movement. And the mythopoetic men's movement was preferred to other suggestions for a name. So originally it's called the New Age men's movement. And as soon as I say the New Age men's movement, perhaps you begin to get a bit of a vibe for where they were coming from. They were against industry and urban living. They thought men should get out into the countryside, bond with each other over fishing and hunting and so forth. There are still echoes of this. I was reading a New York Times article about actually the Epstein moment, and saying what the Epstein moment indicates is a particular way of organizing masculinity, which stepped back from and became, if you like, an urbanized retreat from what had been a relatively conservative movement that sought to reassert a particular kind of masculinity, but which saw itself as a supplement to, a response to feminism, but not, and I'll repeat myself, something that was in competition with or opposed to feminism. Bly makes a really strong case for why his men's movement can sit alongside feminism. And it's really popular. His book was in the New York Times bestsellers list for over a year when it came out. So we've got that as a kind of the basis for the idea of men's rights, the reimagining of masculinity. Fast forward towards the end of the decade, and online cultures have begun to emerge, and a Canadian female graduate looked around and thought, why am I lonely? Why are so many of us lonely? Why can't we develop better relationships? And out of this, she set up a website called Alana's Involuntary Celibacy Project. It was female initiated and it was inclusive. Males, females, people who are identified in a variety of ways in terms of gender and also sexuality. Out of this developed the portmanteau incel. It's a combination of the in from involuntary and cell from the celibate part. Initially it was incel, but people just thought incel sounded better. After a couple of years, Alana, and we don't really know much more about her than her first name, she gave admin rights of her website to another user who she didn't particularly seem to know, and the website developed and it became more male dominated, and copycat websites began to spring up. Among those, loveshy.com is one of the most notable ones, because it's in loveshy.com that we see a radicalized understanding of men's rights begin to develop in the context of incel, involuntary, celibate identities. And Loveshy users were also users of 4chan. So we begin to see this interplay of meme culture, edgelord culture, and indeed far-right politics. Although 4chan also began not as a site dedicated to far-right politics, but became associated with it. So we begin to see this interplay between a transformed version of men's rights, which is men's rights in a kind of a zero-sum competitive form, with this idea of involuntary celibacy, people who aren't able to form relationships or long-term relationships, who become celibate but not out of choice, involuntary celibates. And we see the emergence of a radicalized identity that's associated with incel identities in the context of men's rights. And this is the idea that although they are involuntarily celibate, although they can't have in their own minds relationships, they feel that there are external factors that are stopping them from doing so. And we begin to see a kind of weaponized victimization, which blames women and blames current social structures. Women in general, but feminism in particular. So there's a sense that empowered women become a threat to males who feel slighted, who feel that their opportunities have been removed because of a more aggressive, or in their eyes, any rate, or more particularly, a more independent way of organizing female identity. There's none of the dependency upon them as males that they expected. So a lot of this is around expectation, entitlement, and a sense of victimization. And we see the manosphere emerge as a kind of umbrella term that refers to incels, men's rights activists, and then between those 2 points, I've also included Gamergate, which in 2017 saw a lot of complaints from within male sections or sections among males in the gaming community, in gaming communities, who began to complain about diversity in video gaming. That's diversity in video gaming in terms of characters, female characters, characters of color in video games, in addition to the way in which they perceived the industry as hiring people on the basis of identity rather than ability. So again, we have this sense of aggrieved victimization fueling Gamergate. Gamergate has its links to sections of the loveshy.com community as well as 4chan. So we begin to see how interlinked a lot of the manosphere is. This doesn't mean all of it is, but it means there's a tendency to shift between these different sites and along and through these different networks and narratives. In addition, we have the emergence of pickup artists who, having decided that relationships are quote unquote broken, that they will exploit the dating scene, exploit internet dating, and ultimately this is about males exploiting females. Andrew Tate is probably included within that category. Men going their own way. I've seen this explained by people within this community as a new version of confirmed bachelors. So these are men who would otherwise identify as heterosexual, but are opting out of having anything to do with women out of choice, because as they see it, it's become too complicated. Women have become too demanding. So again, this repeated theme of aggrieved victimization. No fappers, I'm not going to talk about in very much detail. It's inspired by pseudoscience that suggests that if people refrain from masturbation for a week, well, men, they will have a spike in testosterone as a result of this. And we've got this whole internet identity and subculture that's emerged around this. There's good reasons for me not to go into it in any more detail, but I thought I'd mention it just to give you a sense of the kind of the basis of some of the ideas that circulate in the manosphere. You'll also hear a lot of things talked about which come from pseudoscientific studies, alpha, beta, males and so forth, which is based on a study of wolves from 1970, which the author retracted after 6 months when all his fellow environmental scientists said to him, that's not actually how wolf packs work. And he retracted it. But the idea of alphas, betas, and this pecking order in a pack has been picked up and has become naturalized within the manosphere. Within incels, we have the so-called pill categories. I mean, these are real and existing categories that people will identify with or identify other incels with. So most of us are included in the blue pill category. We never took the red pill in the matrix. We are still asleep, dreaming in our virtual simulation of reality. We haven't seen through the lies that surround us, like the red pillars who have awoken from the matrix. And you will hear reference to the Matrix, the film, which is a bit funny given the setup of the scene in which the red pill, blue pill dichotomy emerges, which is a black man offering this younger man this choice in a film which was written, directed by two transgender brothers who are now transgender sisters. And this becomes quite an interesting study of the complexity of gender identity and the racialization of gender identity in its own right. But the red pillars see themselves as having seen through the illusion that the rest of us live under. Purple pill incels kind of sit on the fence. They recognize some of the claims of the red pillars, whilst at the same time keeping one foot in what the rest of us might call the real world. Black-pilled incels are ones who have given up almost entirely in any kind of interaction, given up any hope for a normal life, and have become nihilistic. So it's from here that we see the propensity for violence emerge within incel communities, or incel individuals. Some choose, in their phrase, to lay down and die or lay down and rot, so that they just become functional. Others become much more antagonistic, and it's those that tend to get flagged up as security risks, which is something I'm going to come on to in a later slide. Within the manosphere, clearly misogyny circulates and is part of the cultural lifeblood of the subculture. But there's also conspiracy theories that circulated, especially around the idea that feminism seeks to eradicate the necessity for men at all. This somewhat messy conspiracy theory, I'm just pausing whilst I think, how far down this rabbit hole do I go? I'll summarize that there is a desire to remove all but the most subservient men, and that men who stand up for themselves are perceived as a threat. There is also overlap here with ideas of the Great Replacement theory, which is where we begin to see overlap with the extreme right. As I said, this is an area that I've published on. I've written about the manifestos of Anders Breivik and Brenton Tarrant and the influence of David Lane. Now, these extreme right-wing terrorists all talk about gender in ways that are remarkably similar to the incel black pill community and other parts of the manosphere. So they want to see a return to a traditional gender order, as well as what they see as a traditional ethnic order within the communities that they belong to. They are effectively racists. They may be culturally informed in their nationalism, or they may be racially informed in their nationalism. But the end goal of their politics is either mass deportations in one of its more or in one of its less extreme forms, and a more what we see as a radical form of right wing of the far right. In its most extreme form, there are individuals such as Lane, Breivik, and Tarrant who are seeking to provoke a race war. So that they see this as an inevitable part of the arc of history. And within that, men have their place as warriors, women have their place as mothers. And it's here that we see where the whole trad wife online trend overlaps with this extremist vision of women being reduced to a single role, and that is in reproduction, as mothers who stay in the home. And in some forms, and this is particularly relevant in extreme right women's movements, they see themselves as shield maidens, responsible for the home and as protectors of the home in the last instance, the last wall of literal physical defense. Breivik talked about feminists and cultural Marxists conspiring against European civilization. Tarrant, his manifesto begins with the words, "It's the birth rates, it's the birth rates, it's the birth rates." David Lane's 14 words, which is kind of a famous calling card within the extreme right, is derived from an idea of white genocide. And he puts women and children as central to what white men need to protect. And this is where that overlap happens. The idea in black pill incels of a feminist plot to, in their view, genocide males. And ultimately, what they all have in common is a desire to control women's bodies. And again, it has these wider connotations within extremist circles. But where we see these ideas seep into the mainstream are in debates about birth control, are in debates about women's work, about childcare, about paternity care. All of these become areas where the manosphere and far-right extremists become incredibly active. I've put a picture that I found on Instagram yesterday. I just did a quick search for trad wife on Instagram, and this is the second thing that came up by Better Self Pill, clear reference to pill cultures, the ideal woman. And no male best friends, doesn't accept flirting, extremely beautiful, wears decent clothes, is conservative, feminine, knows cooking, has high morals, not woke. She is religious, hates degenerates. And, when you begin to see phrases like degenerates, we begin to think about the way in which the extreme right constructs these ideas of constructs this idea of the other, its scapegoats, those people who are to blame for what they see as the barriers that prevent them from gaining their birthright. So there's that crossover. We know Breivik, Tarrant, maybe not Lane, but these are all relatively well-known extreme right terrorists. What's less well publicised is the violence associated with incel cultures. And one of the things I will often hear that it's just online talk. It's not really real. It's just edgelords shit posting. But there is a real history of violence associated with the manosphere, and particularly with black-pilled incels. Elliot Rodger, who within the subculture is referred to as the supreme gentleman, Elliot Rodger, he's kind of an ideal form of masculine identity within these subcultures, is possibly the most notorious. He was certainly one of the first identified incel terrorists. And we can go down this list. I'm not going to sort of celebrate them to the extent of using their names, but you can see that this has been and continues to be a set of ideas that inspires real-world violence. The asterisks, in case you were wondering, is that these are murder-suicides by and large. With the exception there of Alec Manassian, who in Canada, and we know that Canada today is dealing with its grief from a school shooting. These are mass killings that have been inspired by incel ideology, and they are international. And there are a few others where there's a combination. These attacks are combined with other ideologies. Those names in red. There's crossover with neo-Nazi or other extreme right-wing ideologies. So, what is the extent of the direct threat in the UK or England and Wales? Because that's our legal jurisdiction. These are prevent referrals, and we know there is something of a generational crisis in radicalisation among young men. Nearly 90% of prevent referrals, and if you're not familiar with it, prevent is one of the UK's branches of anti-terrorism. It does what it says in the can. Its idea is to prevent people falling into radicalised mindsets. So we see 90% of referrals are male and 49% are between 11 and 17. This is young men and boys who are being radicalised. Mental health and neurodiversity. This is often an explanation that can be offered. Only 36%. The baseline for the population is around 20%. So it is above that national average. But the vast majority, 2/3 of people being referred to Prevent, do not have mental health or neurodiverse aspects to their personality. So we can see there is something other than mental health being a key contributor. Extreme right-wing radicalization is the highest proportion of identified ideologies. But one of the issues here is that over half have no ideology identified. As I'll say towards the end, I think one of the issues there is that we're not nuanced enough to recognize the crossover between different ideological forms. Channel cases, those that prevent referrals that end up being passed on to that process of de-radicalization. Here we begin to see extreme right-wing cases pull out as being particularly significant. Only 1% are identified as being incels. So does that mean that this isn't a threat? Is the greater threat from extreme right-wing terrorism? Possibly, yes. We begin to see multiple ideologies. Well, that's a flag up to that crossover. And we already know that the extreme right wing is to some extent inspired by and draws on incel arguments about gender and gender identity. Well, this is what I mean about being more nuanced in our approach. There's also a case, and this was always the case with extreme right-wing violence before we begin to see the use of more spectacular forms of terrorist violence by the extreme right wing, that a lot of it passed under the radar. There's a couple of really good Scandinavian researchers, Bjorgo and Ravindal, who pointed out that a lot of racist attacks were inspired by extreme right-wing ideologies, and they should actually have been classified as right-wing or extreme right-wing terrorism because there was that ideological content within them. Now, when we begin to look at male on female violence, we see that we can begin to understand the manosphere and the regressive attitudes that it represents as a set of ideas that corrodes the status and claim to rights of women and girls in the minds of men and boys who are exposed to those ideas. So if you like it's kind of like an undergrowth which permeates masculine or some masculine cultures, out of which that violence emerges as a one-time growth, but is all connected out of sight. And we know that violence against women and girls is a consistent social harm. The UN Office on Drugs and Crime have published femicides, a yearly femicide report. This is fairly consistent globally, that the vast majority of women are killed by men. For the latest figures that we've got, which were issued at the end of last week, 90% of women killed in England and Wales were killed by men. 40% by a partner or by an ex-partner, 16% by family members. Now, without going too far into this related phenomenon, we return to this idea of men controlling women and men be feeling entitled to control women. The manosphere provides an ideological framework that legitimizes violence against women, and it contributes to extreme right-wing terrorist narratives. So incel cultures, the manosphere, aren't simply about those outbreaks of terrorism, but about providing a legitimizing discourse for continued violence against women at a time when actually we should have progressed past this. It's a regressive set of ideas that drags us backwards. It needs to be pointed out also that in England and Wales, men are more likely than women to be victims of murder or violent crime. The perpetrators are, in the vast majority of cases, men. Men make up a higher proportion of victims of violent crime, and male on male violence is something that typically, again, without going too far into it, although we could, about face-to-face confrontations, not losing face, maintaining one's street cred, if we want to put it in those terms. And this contributes to male insecurity. Men are 3 times more likely than women to die from suicide. Men are also twice as likely to be treated for alcohol or drug dependency. So we can begin to identify that there are problems with masculinity that incel culture and the manosphere feed into, not just in terms of violence against women, but violence among men and men's insecurities, men's frailty in what is a very complex, changing world. So why are we talking about the manosphere now? A lot of popular perception of the manosphere concentrates on sexual rejection and the whole incel culture, and also to some extent a lack of social networks. There's a lot more going on that makes security for individuals diminished. Everyday sexism feeds into a sense of entitlement, of always getting to be the one who speaks or is listened to. In a classroom, in a business setting, and these cultural and behavioural norms feed into a sense of entitlement, along with the continued gender wealth gap. But we're seeing a very precarious political context, and when there is political chaos, we tend to see extremism take advantage of that, and an increase in recruitment and radicalisation. We see increasing economic uncertainty, social precarity, 0-hour contracts, young people not being able to get on the housing ladder, the internet, filter bubbles and echo chambers trapping people into these single limited explanations for why things are like that. It's all about DEI. It's all about feminism, women taking our jobs. These are the partial and diminished explanations that circulate in the cultures I've been talking about. And also that crisis in masculinity. Rather than looking to work alongside feminism, as John Bly was doing in 1990, there's a backlash against feminism, which is more pronounced now than it has been. There are also individual pull factors in why people join the manosphere. There's a sense of community that is persistent and accepting, no matter what problematic thoughts you may be having. There's an explanation for why you were struggling, the whole red pill. And there's also a sense of being able to do something about it, being able to act, taking the black pill and responding in, well, the variety of ways that black pill incels do. So how do we respond to this? I don't have a nice, neat conclusion, unfortunately, because it's difficult. Every one of those issues requires a change in culture and practice. At a person-to-person level, we could become better listeners to boys' and men's fears and their vulnerabilities than internet communities respond. But to do that, we need to build more supportive and more resilient real-life communities to share the load for all of us. And we need a better story to tell. Currently, our social stories seem to oscillate between Trump and Temu, between radical politics and cheap consumerism. And we need a better social story to tell, to be able to say to people, actually, no, the Matrix, as you see it, has more to offer. But this is a political and societal challenge. This is something that we're all involved in. We also need more nuance and adaptability in state-based responses. It's not good enough that Prevent categorise 56% of their referrals as no ideology identified. There are ideas driving people's radicalisation. We just need to be more subtle in our approach. And what routes out have worked? Listening to the lived experience of men who have stepped out of those communities becomes vital. They're the ones who can tell us what worked for them. And don't just take my word for it. There's a large body of and growing body of evidence, of academic study, of research studies that demonstrate that this is the case. Some of those examples on the screen are my publications, but I'm not about to pretend that I'm the only person with the answers. Far from it. In fact, some of these are much better on incel identities than any of my work is. There are also organisations like Boys Impact, who are based at Bournemouth University by a colleague there called Alex Blower. And he's been really good on picking up some of the vulnerabilities of especially working class boys. So there's a lot of work being done in this area, and there's a lot of evidence to support what I've said today. So studying the manosphere is incredibly useful, and sociology is a great way of doing that because it draws together the study of all of these things: gender, online networked subcultures, extremism, precarity and status loss, and also the perception of status loss. Also populism, populist politics, globalization, and what comes after this period of profound change that we're going through. Being able to understand society, the economy and culture and how they interact are vital to be able to work out where we go from here. And this is what we offer in sociology, in BA criminology and sociology, and also in criminology. Criminology touches on these themes. It's more concerned with, if you like, those violent outcomes, those criminal consequences of those ideas. And criminology and sociology sits in between that kind of broad structural approach that sociology offers and that very offence-oriented approach of criminology. I hope what I've said has made you think about ways in which you can use sociology. It's not just about manosphere and the incels, but it's a really good example of how a complex social problem can be understood in a variety of ways. And I thank you. My email's there if you're watching a recording of this and want to ask me questions. Otherwise, I am open to any questions that you may have.
Thanks, Andrew. That was a really great presentation. You went into great depth there. We just got a few minutes left of the webinar and we've got 3 questions so far. So I'll just start with the first one, if that's okay.
Sure, of course.
So the first one is, will we study this type of topic as a student at Derby?
Yeah, absolutely. I run a 3rd year module, which is an optional module, very popular, called Populism, Extremism and Violence. And we talk absolutely about male violence as it pertains to the manosphere and the interaction between that and far-right cultures. We also talk about it in modules such as gender and sexuality in sociology. We'll talk about it there's a module about murder, and that touches on some of that stuff about male-on-male violence and male-on-female violence, and that's a 3rd year criminology module. So without unpicking how these themes run through a lot of our modules, yes, absolutely.
Perfect, thank you. The next question is, can I get involved in research as a student here?
Yeah, I think some of our most valuable modules are modules where we have live briefs come in from local organisations. So third sector organisations who, being pushed for time and resources, can't do the kind of research that would be useful to them. And so we team them up with groups of students who go out and answer the questions that they need. A couple of recent examples have been Safe and Sound, which in the context of today's talk are relevant, who are an organisation in Derby who help young men who are at risk of falling into repeated criminalised behaviours and are therefore vulnerable to exploitation. They didn't have a social media presence, and they've worked with some of our second year students, criminology and sociology students, to devise social media strategy. That's been adopted by them. It's part of their work, their social media platform presence now. And they've also offered roles to some of the students that they worked with, graduate roles. Those graduates have actually been taken on by other organizations who saw the work they'd done, and they swooped in and took our graduates. So it's not only an opportunity to do research, it's an opportunity to make a real difference to local communities, whilst at the same time producing a calling card to demonstrate your skills in research and having that impact.
Super, thank you. There's two interesting questions here. First, I'll go to Emma's. So Emma's question is, when Adolescence came out, there was talk in media and government about it being shown in schools as an educational tool. Do you know if this is going ahead? And don't know if this is going ahead, but if so, do you believe it might be useful for school-aged children?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what would be great would be if educators and maybe some of the school students who would watch it were able to sit down and devise an edit of it, because it's quite a long series. You can't show the whole thing, so you're going to have to show highlights. Which ones are the most impactful? And really, you've got to talk to your target audience to work out which sections those are going to be. But I think, as I said, it doesn't go into the kind of detail that I'm able to go into, but what it does offer is a starting point for conversations about some of these more in-depth responses and developed ways of thinking about the issue. So I think absolutely, as a starting point, yes, it would work brilliantly.
Great, thank you. We've got time for one last question today. So Maria's asked, has said, thank you for the webinar. Do you think the disintegration of the family household, i.e. two parental incomes, fragmentation of families and culture has added to the problem arising?
Well, there's a lot going on there. I say, Maria, that's a great question. Firstly, this idea of what constitutes a stable home. I don't think it's necessary to have two parents present, and they don't need to be gendered in any particular way where they are present. But what you've touched on is that the economic pressures that households, whether they're single parent or dual parent or any other formation, are currently feeling. We're all feeling that economic pinch, and there isn't the provision of adequate childcare resources to provide that supplemental care that would be of benefit to households. And also, if we are talking about young people, their parents or their guardians aren't necessarily the first people that they will turn to as a resource. So it's making sure that there are supplementary forms of support and care. You know, one of the recurring topics that people get round to is what have happened to youth clubs. And as naff as they might have been, it was a place for young people to get together in a structured way, to interact, and often have a role model, an adult role model from outside the family who they could have as a trusted confidant, someone to bounce ideas off, rather than necessarily first port of call going on the internet and the communities that exist there.
Great, that's really interesting, and I've really enjoyed the webinar, so I hope everyone else has too.
Thank you.
I'll hand back to you, Andrew, just to say your final words before the webinar ends.
Well, my final words are thank you so much for finding time in an evening when I think most of us are starting to think about getting dinner ready. So thanks for making that time. Thanks for listening. And honestly, if you have any follow-up questions, do not be afraid to email me and ask them. I'm more than happy to interact, whether you are a prospective student, a teacher or parent. Please get in touch and ask me those questions that you have.